Okay, so I guess we'll 7:30, we'll bring this meeting to order. It's kind of disjointed, but if we could just do a, everybody's here. There's nobody just do a roll call from, start with Joe in the back there, I guess.
At 11. Mark Swackmar, Dean Gould, Bill Brower.
We only need attendance for the members of planning and zoning, since this is our meeting. Thank you, though. John Day.
Tim Young.
Aaron Fargo.
You're up, Joe. David Morse. Okay, we can designate John as our only alternate. He'll be designated today. Next, we do the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't have much to report. Dwight said he couldn't be here tonight. So that's where we're at. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And this is usually a very informative, helpful meeting. So thank Rich for being here and answering all our questions. So we have meeting minutes from March 20th. Were those handed out?
They were sent out the email.
But I can't really look at them. Let's just, we'll do it at the next meeting. Just, we'll pass that so everybody has them in front of them. They can look at them. Pass on it, delay it. So we will start our annual training with attorney Mr. Richard Roberts. Thank you for being here.
Sure, my pleasure. Yeah, Delia sent me a whole bunch of questions and things that people, at least somebody was curious about. One of the first ones was the breakdown of what the powers and duties of each of the different commissions are. And Delia's handed out a kind of a spreadsheet, but also the printouts from UConn's Center for Land Use Education and Research, essentially laying out what the powers and duties of each of the types of commissions are. And you've kind of expanded on that in this spreadsheet. Long and short of it is, since this is the Planning and Zoning Commission, you start with what essentially the duties are. They're two hats that you wear. One of them you probably wear more frequently than others. The Planning Commission is supposed to be looking at kind of the big picture, overall future development of the town, orderly development and that sort of thing. And the two primary functions when you're in the role of the Planning Commission, even on a combined commission, one is plan of conservation and development that I know you're working on now. Every 10 years you kind of go through and evaluate the state of the town and what's working, what's not working, and what you think should be done differently, what kinds of processes should be followed to oversee the conservation and development of the resources in the town, the infrastructure in the town, and that sort of thing. The second primary function of the planning part of the commission is subdivisions. Those of you who've been around for a long time know that for many years, Woodstock had planning with subdivisions before it had zoning. planning went back to like 1965, so that, there was some regulation of the development of land in terms of, the layout of streets and carving up how, lots for house development and so forth. And then zoning kind of came back. After going away in the late 50s, it came back in the 90s. And, here we are. The other roles that you fulfill are in the zoning commission category. And that's basically statutorily enabled regulation of the uses of land. And you do that through the regulations as well as through the zoning map. You divide the town up into zones. We don't really have a whole lot of zones compared to other places where, you look at the map of, pick a town like Stamford, for example, they're probably, 50 or 60 different colors, scattered throughout the map. Here, I think we have 3 or 4 colors scattered throughout the map. And within each zone, certain uses are permitted as of right, certain uses are permitted by special permit, and other uses that aren't specifically enumerated are prohibited. Once you've laid out the zones, laid out the map, then you have your regulations, which go into the detail about how development occurs within each of the zones, within each of the properties. And the handout lists a lot of the things that you can have in your zoning regulations. I don't know when the last time this was updated was, and whether it reflect, August of 23. So it does reflect the changes that took place in 2021 that really made some significant modifications to how the zoning enabling statute was laid out. But it covers what uses are permitted, whether there are any particular restrictions on those uses, conditions on those uses, conditions on buildings that are constructed, and also the whole category of special permit uses where they're things that aren't as of right, like houses would be. So there are additional criteria that have to be met that are in the zoning regulations in order to go forward with that. And that generates the public hearing and lots of controversy and discussion sometimes not. But that's when you're wearing the zoning hat. I don't know, do you have any questions on that at all? Don't be shy. One of the other land use bodies in town is the Zoning Board of Appeals. And essentially by law, if you have a zoning commission and zoning regulations, you have to have a zoning board of appeals. And the purpose is basically to do 2 things. One, primary one is to evaluate the granting of variances from the zoning regulations. So the way it was described was basically a safety valve against zoning regulations where, due to a particular situation related to a particular piece of property, the zoning regulations can't be strictly applied, and it would be an unusual hardship to have to comply with them. So if the topography or the shape of your property prevents you from being able to comply with the setbacks or lot coverage or something like that, you can go to the zoning board of appeals and seek a variance from them to get relief from the restrictions that the zoning regulations impose. The second primary function of the zoning board of appeals is when the zoning enforcement officer you know, gets a swelled head with all of the power that comes with that office and starts being, you know, arbitrary and capricious in terms of how the zoning regulations are being interpreted and applied. If you receive an order from the zoning enforcement officer and you disagree with it, you can appeal that to the zoning board of appeals and say, you know, he's misunderstanding how these regulations should work. Please overturn the decision. And in a situation like that, the zoning enforcement officer goes in and explains, well, this is how I reached my conclusion. This is how I made my determination as to what the zoning regulations say and what they do. And, you know, this was my analysis and why I think it was a correct interpretation of the zoning regulations. And at that point, the person who is aggrieved by it will make their argument saying, yeah, but, and, you know, then the zoning board of appeals basically, you know, evaluates the interpretation of the ZEO and either upholds it or reverses it. There are a couple other statutory powers that previously had been assigned to the zoning board of appeals in terms of certifying appropriate locations for gas stations and car dealers and that sort of thing, but that mercifully was taken away either last year or the year before. It had been one of those things where the legislature had almost like a stalker-like obsession with changing the statute every year, you know, in terms of who had jurisdiction over what and how. So that's kind of the ZBA. One of the critical things about it and why it's important to have fully populated zoning board of appeals of 5 members, you know, and you can have up to 3 alternates, is that by statute, if you apply for a variance, you have to get 4 out of the 5 votes to support you. Same thing with overturning the CEO's decision. So, you know, that's why sometimes if you have a ZBA and you're having trouble making a quorum or having, you know, adequate people on it, it can be a real problem. Yes, you in the back.
I can go back to the zoning. The commission's been talking about a mixed use zone. And as we were talking about zoning, I was wondering how does the commissioner go about designating the new zone, and do the property owners in that proposed zone have to agree to that designation as a new zone? Most of the town is a community district. So that's my question. How do you go about doing that, and do you need the landowners permission?
I guess, you know, I haven't been privy to the conversations that you've had to know, you know, how you've been thinking about doing the mixed use zone, whether it's, you know, mixed use is being allowed in a zone by special permit or creating something that is, you know, a new zone that allows mixed uses and, you know, keeps it out of other parts of the town.
Well, forget the mixed use part. Maybe just focus on how do we create a new zone?
Either the commission or a property owner, or, you know, hypothetically a developer, could file an application for an amendment to the zoning map saying, you know, I guess the first step would be to amend the regulations to create the new zone. And probably simultaneously with that, you would file an application to amend the map so that you would know where the zone is. Otherwise, you know, people may be a little wary about creating a zone without knowing where it goes. You know, likewise, you may not, it wouldn't be a good idea to create the zone on the map without having regulations to control it. So I think, you know, they'd probably both be done at the same time. And, you know, it can be on the initiative of the commission, or it can be on the initiative of the property owners. If, you know, and had at various times served on planning and zoning in the town where I lived, and where there were some properties that made no sense as to the zone that they were in, so the commission itself filed an application proposal to change the zone, of those lots. And the property owners came in and in a couple of cases made a very compelling argument why they didn't want to have it changed. So, that was sort of dropped. I guess as a practical matter, the commission could change the zone, and the people who own property within that zone could appeal the decision, or they could probably, if a lot of people within the zone in the proposed area felt strongly about it, they could do a protest petition, which would require a heightened voting requirement of the commission to change the zone. But it's kind of a philosophical decision of, do you impose it on people, or do you, sort of persuade them or convince them that, this is this will be better for you in the long run, because, you'll have a wider variety of options for using your property. We're not going to take away anything you already have, in terms of taking your house and making it non-conforming. So, for example, you couldn't add on to it or replace it and that sort of thing. But if the commission is doing it and gets the buy-in by explaining how it isn't going to take away anything that the property owner already has, but it will give you the opportunity to do more new things, or it may increase your property values, which some people see that as a good thing. Some people who hate paying taxes don't see that as a good thing. But it is something that either the commission itself could do, or the property owners themselves could do, or someone who has a bright idea. I think, if it's a third party other than either the town or the property owners would have to consent to it. So you can't, drive into town from somewhere else and say, I'm gonna rezone everything, south of 171 as, commercial.
Thank you.
Yep. The other one on the list here is the Wetlands Commission. Coincidentally, or interestingly, that's the only commission that every town in the state is required to have. You can have zoning or not, you can have planning or not, but because wetlands commissions are essentially carrying out the regulation on behalf of the state, every town has to have a wetlands commission. And the long and short of what their jurisdiction is to maintain a map that shows where the wetlands boundaries are, and to hear applications for proposed what they call regulated activities that occur either in the wetland or because of their proximity to the upland review area or something like that, have the potential to affect the regulated areas. And there's some things that are permitted as of right. A lot of them relate to, farming and maintaining a pre-existing residence and that sort of thing. But lots of kind of digging and filling and building and moving that occurs within the upland review area is subject to the review of the Wetlands Commission. They definitely need to follow their regulations. One of the things that people tend to either assume or members of wetlands commissions also sometimes assume is that they have vastly greater authority for environmental protection than they really do. And quite often it's when people are opposing a particular development, they go into the wetlands commission, you know, with all these explanations of the death and destruction that's going to result from the project. And, you know, at some point, there's usually the rude awakening that, you know, our jurisdiction is limited to, you know, regulated activities within, you know, the review area of the wetlands and water courses, and this is the level of what you have to prove. So, you know, it can't just be kind of a generalized fear of pollution that leads to the Wetlands Commission denying an application. It has to be something that ties back to the regulations and, you know, can be demonstrated through science. The last one that's on here is the Conservation Commission, which is something that towns are allowed to have as well. And, you know, they have advisory powers. They can make recommendations, they can create inventories of, you know, open space land in the town or natural resources and come up with, you know, guidance or suggestions or plans and so forth, and they can weigh in on all kinds of applications, but as a general rule, they don't have any inherent regulatory authority like planning, zoning, and wetlands do. Do you want to talk about the other things that you put on here?
Sure. Dan, you can send it out to the UVA and to the Wetlands Commission. So it has all the different parties involved in the development. So you all have it in front of you, and you can see that it has the property owner, developer, entrepreneur, professional consultant, health department, and then the commissions, the wetlands and planning and zoning, because those are the regulatory commissions and permitting development. And then the staff and the town's consultant engineer, and then as you go across the table, it explains which of these different parties has a role in which part of the development process. So I wrote it to help everybody understand which role and where it is in the, you know, from start to finish.
All right. Does anybody have any questions about that? Opens for business.
Did you have anything else? I did have a question from,
I had a list of questions. That was all I had on these things.
okay. I just had, before I forget, I had a question from Dwight, because he can't be here. And I wanted to ask about the training the state has decided that we have to have hours. Is anybody keeping track of that? Do we report that to the state? I mean, or did they just make this rule and then have nothing to go along with?
You're kind of on the honor principle. Somebody in town is supposed to be keeping track of what training you've been to. And, you know, if it's not something that you do as a group, you're sort of, you know, the onus is on you to tell, you know, Delia or Dan or somebody, you know, I went to this, I went to that, I watched this, I watched that. Because, and frankly, I'd be really curious to see how many towns have actually done it. The statute requires that I think it's sometime in March, each of the commissions is supposed to report to the legislative body of their town, which here would be the selectmen, you know, whether everyone has complied with it or not. And, you know, I know some places have actually done a pretty good job of keeping track of, you know, who's been to different things and, you know, did you do your hour of fair housing, affordable housing, that sort of thing, and it's at the point where you can comply with all of the requirements by, watching things online that are canned from the comfort of your own home without going anywhere. So it's easy to comply if you're so inclined.
So it's just basically saying, I watched so many hours of video from UConn.
Right, yeah, there are 3 videos kind of in one module that altogether have exactly what you need to comply. And the other thing that has changed is that originally it was like every year you had to do it. And now it's I think, essentially every term that you're.
Every term or every 2, I've heard 2 years too, but I don't know what.
No, I think it's. At one point, I think it was 2 years, but now I think it's, if you have to do it within the first year of when either the rule went into effect or when you were elected or appointed, you have, essentially a year to get 4 hours. And then you're good for the rest of your term.
And if you're reelected, you have to do it again.
I can't remember whether it's every 4 years, but I think
Oh,
it hasn't been in effect that long, but yeah, I think if you're reelected, you would have to do it again, at least once during that term. The whole mystery of this requirement is that nowhere does it say anything about what happens if you don't do it. Originally the legislation said, that was being proposed said that if somebody hasn't complied with the requirements, they can't vote on things. And, aside from being impossible to kind of monitor, it also would have probably brought, land use bodies in the state to a screeching halt.
Yeah.
The only thing that anybody can think of is that if somebody comes in with an affordable housing application and it's denied, and some or all of the commission members haven't fulfilled the requirement and done the affordable housing, they can use that as evidence that you people weren't qualified to evaluate the application, but that hasn't come to pass. And I haven't heard of any consequence yet of anybody who hasn't fulfilled the requirements.
Just to piggyback off of that. Last month, we submitted our spreadsheet to Chan. The training hours that people have logged. PZC is in really good shape. We have a couple members who haven't fulfilled any of the training requirements. We did poll commissioners a couple of weeks ago. Tracy sent out, please send us what you've attended. A lot of people got compliant with this last Saturday bar association training. That was 3 hours, 4 hours on one side, half hour for the affordable housing. Tonight's affordable housing will give you the full hour that's required.
Well, actually, that one, they changed the program, the CBA program, to have 2 half hours on affordable housing. So if you endured that whole thing, you got the full hour.
Perfect. I know a lot of people were in attendance. I'm keeping track of attendance for tonight's meeting, but please, if you haven't answered Tracy's email or seen it, we've been looking to chart your hours, especially recent stuff.
I can send you a link to online training. If you still have more requirements, you can do it online, and then just make sure you let Dan know. I'll send it out next week.
Yeah, I did a bunch of it online. really, most of it's through UConn.
Yeah.
It's, pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's not, it's painless, you can just kind of put it on in the car and drive around and check the box.
Yeah. Thing on Saturday, what are they?
Yeah, the bar
put on
says.
Saturday. That was, it was interesting. For the most part, I mean, there was a couple of them that weren't really too applicable, but. It was, I've gone to it in person. That's a long haul. But I think doing it, when you can sit at home and listen to it, in the comfort of your house, it wasn't too bad.
No, and the other thing too is that, we used to do it at Wesleyan and it was in kind of the science building auditorium. And it was limited to 250 people in the room. There were a couple of overflow rooms and, invariably there'd be some kind of IT hiccup where, 40 people would all be yelling, "I can't hear" at the same time. But online, I think there were 737 people signed up and, there were like 650 on there most of the time.
They said they were gonna send us the chat because people were asking questions that would be responded to. And they were supposed to send that out to us. I haven't seen it yet.
No, you haven't seen it yet. We're still cleaning it up because like a third of the questions and answers were people telling the presenters how to change their PowerPoint presentation views and, thank you and, Jim from Bridgewater and, that sort of thing. But I know they're working on it. She was hoping to get it out either this week or beginning of next week. Yeah, there were a couple of people who had lots of questions. All right, one of the, Delia forwarded some on, I don't know whether she made them all up or whether they're actually questions that other people wanted to know the answers to, but what happens to the open space in a subdivision when they haven't maintained the homeowners association? When the open space is supposed to be maintained or whatever by the association? Well, I guess the short answer is it's not the town's problem. It would be. Would be an issue for the homeowners association or the property owners to sort of sort things out. Usually, usually either it just completely goes to waste or some people, step up and do what needs to be done. I don't know whether.
It's been a problem sometimes where, you find out sometimes when someone comes in because they want to get a permit to build something, that's when like the staff might find out that they're actually using the open space for something they're not supposed to. But staff doesn't have time to be checking on these, so I don't know when they're supposed to be checked or just so they're not just turning into backyard ATV parks or gardens or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of goes to the question of, when you're doing a subdivision or setting aside open space, who keeps title to it? Who's responsible for enforcing the restrictions? Who's responsible for the stewardship of the open space? And my sense is that, sometimes it's the town, sometimes it's the Conservation Commission. But a lot of times it's just a restriction that, it is put on without any clear explanation as to, who has enforcement rights. But I think it seems like it would either be the homeowners association and or the town, or if there is no homeowners association and the whole subdivision was kind of sold with the open space being the amenities, it seems like any of the property owners in the subdivision would have the ability to, seek to enforce the restrictions, but that requires more effort than most private homeowners want to incur to force their neighbor to do something that they should have been doing in the first place. And strikes me that quite often that is when people come into town hall and demand that you do something about it, even though you have no, legal or contractual obligation or right to do it. So, that's why when you're doing subdivisions with open space in them, you want to be very clear on, what the restrictions are and who has the ability to enforce them. And, it can be the town, but I think, as a practical matter, you have plenty to do already. And that isn't gonna end well.
Can you give an example of how that might be worded?
Yeah, I mean, the standard template that we use in some of the towns essentially says, as a condition of approving this subdivision, the developer imposes a conservation easement and on lots 2, 3, and 4, and it gives the meets and bounds and it shows where they all are. And it specifically identifies what can't be done in those areas, the rights that the owner retains in those areas. And then it will say, in the case of a violation of these restrictions, it may be enforced either by, any of the other lot owners in the subdivision or by the town. But that the town has no obligation to do it.
So if it's an open space, say it's an open field, you can't do anything with it, it has to stay that way. Who's gonna maintain it? Does that specifically have to be written in that, say you have lots 1, 2, and 3 are gonna maintain that? If we got to step far enough into that to say that there needs to be a fee generated, like you would in like a condo, a maintenance fee that's gonna allow that to be mowed twice a year or something to maintain that, I can see how this goes into a brick wall. You've got 3 lots, this guy lived in it for 2 years and then moved out. And now you've got the new guy on the block, he's part of the ownership, but they don't talk to him because he's the new guy on the block. So where is the regulation in there that says, no, this has to be maintained?
Usually when it's a conservation easement, like the one I described, it's, frankly, the wetlands around the edges of the property and the trees and the cliffs and things like that. It's not an open, viable arable field. If it was gonna be an open space, a subdivision that included open space that had, 5-acre field in the middle of it that is supposed to be kind of an amenity for everybody. I think as the developer, you would want to write something in there about the homeowners having to contribute to the maintenance or that they could agree to have somebody else take care of it for them or something like that. It would be more than just kind of the off the shelf, don't cut down all the trees and dig holes and bury things. Conservation restriction that you see most common.
But you'll see, we'll have an area that, has to be left aside because of surface drainage or gutters are all going to that area because this happens to be a low-lying area, so that has to be a plan. That area has to be maintained. Of course, the human instinct is if you have a ditch, you have to fill it. You know, so that's where the leaves go, and that's where the tree trimmings go. They all fill in the ditch. Gotta do that. How do you write into these regulations to see to it these things are
Well, we
taken
just
care of?
had one like that. and it was
Yeah,
really
we
neat
did.
that
That's why I'm
included
kind of
it,
bringing it up,
But
because
Well,
that was a big discussion.
talk about it, but, there are a couple examples I can think of. Exit Village, that's a subdivision that has open space with active recreation. I believe that was deeded to the towns. I think the town's taken over the maintenance of it. Most of the open space that we have is more of the conservation restriction where you can't do anything. And sometimes you're allowed to submit like a, forestry plan if you wanted to maintain it for healthy habitat. You're supposed to submit some kind of a plan about how many trees you cut down or whatever. There's been a couple of those. And if it's an agricultural easement, then it specifies that the farmer can still farm the land, and it might have a few details on how much of the land, or maybe they can build a barn or something like that. We've had some of those.
Yeah, I think if it's gonna be something that's not just keep the trees around the edge of the subdivision, you have to be careful when you put it in and be deliberate as you come up with what the terms of the approval are. You're talking about the ditch, it reminds me, one of the ones that we're dealing with in another town is the property owner had the detention basin from the whole subdivision road off to the side of his property. And he was really tired of having it there, so he filled it in. But before he filled it in, he went to the Board of Assessment Appeals to get his property value lowered because he had the detention basin on his property. And so they lowered his property value because he had the detention basin, and then he filled it in. So. All right, the next question is, what's the limit for using the term character in the land use regulations or the POCD? That's one of the things that was hotly debated back a few years ago. Because the perception was that the concept of character was sort of a proxy for single family houses on large lots that didn't include affordable housing, and that, if you were going to build a duplex, that wasn't in line with the character of the zone or the neighborhood or so forth. So, just the word character became the third rail. And one of the things that was changed in Public Act 2129 that did a whole lot of kind of wholesale revisions to the land use statutes. Previously, it had said that, your regulations could, require that things be consistent with the character of the neighborhood and so forth. That got taken out, and a new provision came in that essentially said that now your zoning regulations cannot be applied to deny any land use application, including for any site plan approval, special permit, or any other zoning approval on the basis of a district's character, unless such character is expressly articulated in such regulations by clear and explicit physical standards for site work and structures. So you can still talk about character, but you have to have objective criteria, and you have to explicitly state them, in the regulations, and that the characteristics can't relate to the immutable characteristics, sources of income, or income level of any applicant or end user other than age or disability, when age restricted or disability restricted housing may be permitted. So, basically you can't rely on character to keep out you know, affordable housing or multifamily housing. And if you're gonna talk about character, you have to have, you know, specific objectively viable criteria that you use to establish what the character is.
Such as a scenic road.
You know, interestingly, that's different because it's not zoning.
Okay.
And yes,
With character being as general as like preserve the architectural character of the area? Or does it have to go into have a Victorian style, Georgian style, mix of arts and crafts, and things like that?
I think the more specific and detailed you can be so that it relates to, you know, something tangible rather than, you know, we'll know it when we see it approach to, no, that's out of character with the neighborhood, that is, you know, more than just frowned upon now. When it comes to land use and nonprofit or informal activities such as formal or informal clubs, where is the threshold when a special permit is required? If it's not regulated by zoning, then is it a civil matter if neighbors are upset or impacted by the activity? I guess the starting point for that analysis is whether whatever the activity is that people are offended by, actually rises to the level of being a land use rather than something that is an incidental or accessory activity being carried on by the property owners. And that's a judgment call. And I guess when you're looking at making that analysis, you should look at things like, is it customary and incidental to a residential use? I mean, people having friends over to play poker on Friday night. You do that and you have 5 cars on the, in the driveway and people are laughing and so forth. That's probably a normal incidental activity for a residential dwelling. But if you have 20 people over to play poker every night of the week, is it getting to the point where it's no longer something that would be reasonably expected to occur in a residential neighborhood? And is it becoming a use on its own that goes beyond what would be customarily accessory to a residential use? And I think it's, as I said, I think it's a judgment call based on the type of activity, the frequency of the activity, the intensity of the activity, the external consequences of the activity in terms of, noise, parking, smell, whatever. And I think another aspect of it is, that can be important is whether it's, something that's free or whether people are paying to participate or, contributing in some other manner to participate in. So, I think I remember Dan forwarding me what the specific question was, and without going into too much detail about a specific question, that's sort of how I would approach the question generally. So I don't know, did you have any follow-up on that?
I think that's great information. This is a judgment call, and we need the answers to those kind of questions to form a judgment. I did find, it's up, the property owner is an LLC. And I think that kind of starts to shift it in a certain direction for me. But
Yeah, I mean, that. You know, that again would be one of the factors, but, you know, is it an LLC because it's a, you know, in an LLC for family estate planning purposes, or is it because there's some kind of, you know, business purpose underlying the ownership and the use of the property, and, you know, the people who live there are just kind of there for purposes of facilitating the activity. You know, that's the type of analysis that you would have to go through to, you know, sort out whether it's something that, you know, is a reasonable accessory use of a residential property, or is it something that, you know, has become a non-residential use of its own that may need to be, you know, either regulated or terminated. What are the rules surrounding commission members speaking with each other? It should be prohibited. Is simply talking about the merits or drawbacks of a proposed project with a single other commission member, I assume that means one, not somebody who's single, not allowed. If so, why? If the discussion doesn't constitute a quorum, then presumably clarification, questioning, and scrutiny of an application by two brains working together would lead to better decisions. If it is allowed, how many can participate? I mean, that's an interesting question. And there's, you know, there's not a whole lot of case law on it. There's very limited freedom of information case law on it. You start with the premise that the safest answer is that the only time you should be doing planning and zoning work is when you're at a planning and zoning meeting. And, you know, the rest of the time you just don't talk about it with anybody. That's the safest answer. It's also the most unreasonable and unrealistic one. And the reason I say that it's the safest one is because almost any time you talk with anybody about, you know, whether it's another commission member, a member of the public, your spouse, the applicant, a total stranger, when you talk to anybody about something that is pending before the commission, it's probably technically ex parte communication. If it's occurring outside of, you know, the four corners of the meeting. Not all ex parte communication is problematic. And the difficulty is avoiding the point at which it becomes problematic. If you are walking out of the room with another commission member and, you know, there's been a presentation, and turn to the other and say, wow, that presentation was a piece of crap, wasn't it? And it's like, yeah, you're right. You know, that isn't necessarily a problem because you're not exchanging any new prejudicial information with each other. Where I think you need to be careful is two different areas. One, where one member talks to another one, and then the same member talks to somebody else and says the same thing, talks to another one and says the same thing, and talks to another one and says the same thing, or you know, it essentially creates a train of cars of people having the same conversation outside of the context of the hearing. Even though you know, at no time is it more than, you know, maybe two or three people having the conversation. You know, it never reaches the quorum, but the word is out and everybody, you know, has basically participated in the same conversation or a similar conversation outside of the context of the hearing or the meeting. The other time that it's a problem is when you're talking to someone and what either you say to them or what they say to you is kind of new important information that isn't available to everybody else and isn't able to be corrected by the applicant or the opponent or somebody else. So if it's evidentiary and prejudicial to someone, you know, even if it's just a one-on-one conversation, you know, it can be problematic. And the ideal way to deal with that is that if, you know, if it's a public hearing that's been continued or, you know, a meeting where you haven't had the vote yet, you know, if whatever the information is, whatever the conversation is, whatever the discussion is, can be, you know, essentially brought into, you know, the public forum so that everybody gets the benefit of the same information. You know, anyone who is affected by that information has the ability to say, hey, wait a minute, no, that's not true. This is what the real story is, so that they can, you know, so they can address it and correct it. You know, those are the kinds of situations where I think, you know, you can get into trouble, as if it's basically a subterfuge to, you know, lobby for a particular outcome, or if, you know, it's information that is really relevant to the decision-making process that is being kept from members of the public or participants in the process. I don't know. Any questions on that, or? I know
Well,
it's
so that was my question. I guess I think of it along the lines of judges sitting on a panel and discussing a case and sort of trying to figure out, is your understanding of the law, this is, how did you understand what was said there, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, for purposes of clarification and deeper understanding of the issue. And I guess I sort of understand, I think of ex parte as going outside of the room and talking to other people without, and not bringing the information back to the commission. The commissioners talking to each other for purposes of deeper understanding of the issue struck me as being very much akin to, you know, judges on a panel sort of. I mean, that's what happens in the Supreme Court, right? Those guys like sit around and go, you know, what do you think about that, et cetera, et cetera. So how is it different? Why is it different for a commissioner than for a panel of judges? That was sort of the essence of my.
yeah, I mean, and you know, I fully appreciate the analogy, but at least my take on it is that, you know, they are a deliberative body in secret. You are a deliberative body in public.
Yep.
And you know, as an agency subject to freedom of information, when you are doing the public's business, when you're evaluating pros and cons of an application, frankly, I think the applicant and the public at large would be appreciative of knowing that this is how the thought process was going and how you reached your decision, you know, as opposed to, you know, showing up and Dave says, first item, and then somebody says, I make a motion to deny. It's seconded and unanimously approved, and nobody knows how you reach that conclusion and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically a function, at least in my mind, of, of the nature of the world in which planning and zoning commissions operate, where you really shouldn't be transacting the commission's business other than during the commission's meetings.
Okay.
Yes.
Just maybe to follow up on that, the conversation is about commissioner to commissioner, but what if a commissioner has a question after the meeting is adjourned? And the next day calls a staff member to say, is this what was meant? And the commissioner is talking to a staff member. That a little different than the commissioner talking to the commissioner of the supermarket?
Yeah, I think so, because, there are exceptions to the ex parte rules to allow commission members to receive information from staff even after the hearing is closed, within certain guardrails. So, if you say, well, I was a little unclear on how, what your explanation was or what your interpretation was, and you ask that the next day, then I think that's perfectly reasonable. Again, if the decision hasn't been made yet and you think it's relevant to your thought process, it may be worth mentioning it at the next meeting to say, after the last hearing, I was a little vague on, how we calculate X, Y, or Z, and, Delia said that her interpretation was this, that, so that, everybody kind of gets the benefit of the information, because, frankly, there may be more people who are confused or, unaware of the thing that you asked about. The one that you want to avoid, and it happened when on the commission that I was on one time, where can't even remember what it was. I think it was expanding a church, and it was going to be building significantly higher in an area right near some residential properties. And, the neighboring property owners came in and said, this thing's going to be, casting shade on all of our houses, and, it's going to destroy the look of the neighborhood and so forth. And, I think we actually did close the public hearing, but put off the deliberations until the next meeting. So at the next meeting, after the hearing is closed, one of the commission members during the discussion said, yeah, I was a little concerned about the size of the building and, and how it was going to work after the last meeting. So I went over there and I talked with the priest, and he showed me where it was going to be, and told me that I didn't have anything to worry about. So now I'm not at all concerned about it. And like, oh, okay.
If I could add about staff, I'm your resource and Cameron's your resource. So if you have a question about an application, you can email us or call us. They're part of why we are your planning consultant. But we don't get to vote. So we can answer your questions, and we meet with the applicant and we answer their questions. And that's what we're there for.
If I could drill down just a little bit more, we often get packets of information before the meeting. So we'll often have an application before any discussion starts. And if we want to talk to another commission about, hey, did you see what's in the packet that's coming up next week? Okay, you're saying no, right? All right. Shouldn't be talking about that, even if it hasn't been presented to the commission yet at a meeting.
Well, you shouldn't be making a decision about it
No,
before it's been presented.
Not talking about a decision, but just trying to get a better understanding. The narrative that went with a subdivision or special permit application didn't make sense. And somebody, commissioner who lives nearby, might say, do you have any idea of what's going on with this thing? Again, before the meeting.
Just ask, what's so important about that discussion? You can't do it at the meeting.
it's not so much important, touch it. You run into somebody, it's casual, kind of on.
Only the discussion, if it's at the meeting, if you have questions, the applicant should be given the chance to respond to the question. And then you get your answers. If you guys both don't know the project, you're not, assuming most of you are not engineers or surveyors or soil scientists or whatever. Discussing amongst yourselves, you probably won't produce the answer.
Okay.
So, I mean, what happens in real life is you read these packets. And sometimes you get excited, about, you know, this looks, this is kind of neat. And then you read it closer and you go, oh, well, it doesn't seem so. I mean, as an example, I mean, I guess this gets into the next question. As an example, the tennis courts at Woodstock Academy were up for a vote. And when I got my packet, I looked at it and I thought, I have no idea where these tennis courts are. I drove over there. I wandered around. I ran into the super. I said, do you have any idea where the tennis courts are going in? And the guy goes, oh, yeah, here they are. I looked at it, it looked great. It looked like really a nice site. And I went back and I was incredibly satisfied. And I guess I sort of got excited by it. It seems like to keep it such a dull, dry exercise is, I don't know, it just sort of is not that much fun.
Yeah, the next question, if you hadn't figured it out, was about sidewalks. We're visiting a site prior to the meeting. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be unusual for every one of you to have an intimate knowledge of every parcel of property in the town of Woodstock. You probably know where the roads are and you can guess where things are, but you know, driving by and looking at it, and maybe getting out and looking at it is not an unreasonable thing to do. If it's a, you know, big enough or complicated enough project that it's going to be a substantial development, then I think, you know, having a formal sidewalk would make sense. You know, I know wetlands does it frequently. It's less common for planning and zoning to do it just because of the nature of what the applications are, but you know, I think if it is a big project or one that requires you know, seeing it to be able to appreciate it, then, you know, setting it up would be a good thing. You know, and if people can go, so be it. Again, one of the things that has generated a lot of freedom of information complaints is when, you know, sometimes towns or commissions would set up site visits in such a way to manipulate it so that it would never be a quorum of people. You know, it's like, you know, right, 3 of you go at 1, 3 of you go at 2, and 3 of you go at 3. You know, and that didn't cut it. But no, there is a lot of value to seeing a particular project if it is a significant one. I mean, if it's just you know, changing a use in an existing building that you've been in or can see from the parking lot, then probably not worth the effort. But
Quick question. Going back to that one about the church that you said in that commissioner. That was not good that after the public hearing closed, that he went and talked to the priest about that.
Right.
Okay, I just want to make sure that
yeah,
it's not good.
no, that was bad.
Okay.
Yeah,
You wouldn't come out right out and say that. No, I just want to make sure that I know it's bad. I just want to make sure that was.
no,
That was
that was bad.
okay. Clearing it up, making
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, we didn't let him stay on as chairman the next term.
That's all you have to do.
Yeah, really. Step up your game.
They're on here.
I don't know, you had a lot more questions about site plans and site walks and so forth. Did you want to talk about that or?
I think we covered the sidewalk, I think sufficiently, but we've been talking quite a bit recently about whether we should do site plan review. Woodstock doesn't have that. Right now, they have special permit. And we have something we call non-residential zoning permit, which is the turnover of a land use on a property that has previously been non-residential. And may not be the best way to do it, but otherwise you have to do a special permit. But right now, the standards or the requirements require A2 surveys and a lot of information, which can be very expensive. And if the business is really not doing a lot to the site, they're not paving new parking lots, they're not doing new buildings, seems reasonable, there'd be a lot less required. And so perhaps a site plan review would be sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, and I would. It seems like, a site plan is part of it, a special permit application, but there may be. In like the non-residential context or some other ones. Just having a site plan review where all you're looking at is, how things are gonna be laid out in the portion that's gonna be developed, what's gonna be changed. Look at things like lighting and parking and, facades and signs and so forth. You don't. If you're redoing the parking lot, maybe look at the drainage and those kinds of things. Rather than having to resurvey the entire parcel. I know that, right, I think that your regulations are written in such a way that, the commission can waive the requirement that some things be provided if you've essentially determined that they aren't necessary for any, an appropriate evaluation of the application. But creating kind of a separate category of approved uses that can be approved simply by coming in, with a site plan that doesn't necessarily trigger a public hearing and the full parade that comes with that, something that you might want to consider. Particularly for properties that already have had some kind of non-residential development.
Well, then that site plan review doesn't stay with the land forever. It's like a special permit. It's there, it goes with the land forever.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the site plan is sort of a more transitory, here's what we're building today. If there's. The presumption is that whatever use it is that is covered by the site plan is already permitted. So you don't need to, put something on the land records that's going to change the zoning forever because it's already, an activity that is permitted, but only requires a site plan review.
So what if you have site plan review use and that business closes? And what happens if a new business comes in and it's the exact same kind of business? Do they need anything, any sort of review, or they just move in and move their inventory in or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it's not by any means apples to oranges, but I live in Weathersfield and there are, a lot of changes in retail uses that never come to the commission because, they're not changing the building, they might be changing the sign. The amount of parking required for a particular size space is not going to change. It's swapping out one retail use for another. If it's another use that is permitted as of right in the zone by site plan only, like, professional office or, restaurant or something like that, maybe the site plan will require, you to show the upcoming parking and.
Do they
So,
just come in for another site plan, or they just,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, and,
so retail to retail is fine?
well, yeah, I mean, quite
Retail
often
to restaurant
that's
would be
done.
another site plan review?
The terminology that used to be in the regulations that I think we took out because people thought it was kind of funny was. Kind of stupid was that, they would have to come in to get approval for a change that was not significant. And, you know, so,
So what they do with significant changes?
well, they would have to come in for those too, but, you know, they would have to bring less. You know, for a change that was not significant, and at one point, we just revised the regulations to allow. Changes that were not significant to be handled by the staff. So that, you know, they weren't held up for a month coming in, you know, with essentially, you know, something showing. You know, we're gonna put a handicap bathroom in the front of the building and change the sign. Because nobody cared, so, yeah, if you're serious about trying to think of some kind of like interim step of regulatory process, you know, that's something to look at.
I was thinking it's sort of a little bit, a few steps towards performance-based zoning. So instead of like the regular zoning, you have standards and this use has to have this lot size and this number of parking spaces and meets these setbacks and those kinds of rules. But performance-based zoning would be more about, instead of the use, like, instead of retail versus bookstore, versus like restaurant or professional office. If you have the building and nothing else is changing about the site and the building, and it turns over from one use to another, it could be a much less of a deal than a big special permit, because the building's not changing, not making it any bigger, or any taller. You're not adding parking, you're not changing the impervious surfaces. The building itself is staying the same, whether it has offices and computers inside versus shelves with inventory. Is that such a big deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're gonna be looking at that, you know, what you need to keep in mind is, you know. What are the external impacts of the change in the business? You know, is it gonna be, you know, 400 people sitting there all day long, sitting at their computers as opposed to, you know, 20 people coming in, going out, coming in, going out. You know, what are the hours of operation? Just, yeah, the details of what the, you know, what the activity is, and, you know, what, if anything, is different in terms of, you know, the impact of that activity.
Is that the end of your list of questions, or do you have more?
Yeah, that's the list of questions.
Joseph, go ahead.
Yes, you in the back.
I just want to confirm my understanding of zoning regulations in general. Our zoning regulations have a specific listing of permitted uses by right, a specific list of uses that need a special permit, and then a specific list of prohibited activities. My understanding is if there's a proposal for a land use that's not on the permit by right or permit by special permit, it's not allowed unless the regulation is written to allow that.
Yeah, that's generally correct.
Okay.
Back in the olden days, you know, because zoning was first implemented to prevent noxious uses, you know, it would come in with a list of things you could do and then a list of things you couldn't do. You know, the one town I can think of, I mean, it had like 3 pages of aluminum smelting and rendering and fertilizer manufacturing and bone mills and all kinds of things that were prohibited, and it was difficult because times changed, and there would be more current things that people would decide they didn't want to have that weren't on the list, and you would just be kind of chasing yourself trying to do that. So by and large, most, other than form-based zoning, which is kind of a new breed, most zoning regulations these days, and yours included, are permissive, meaning it tells you what you can do, and if it's not on the list, you can't do it unless you, quite often there's a sort of a catch-all provision at the end of something that the commission determines is sufficiently similar to another permitted use to be allowed, so that you don't necessarily have to amend your zoning regulations every time somebody creates a new kind of activity. The way we live our lives now compared to 20 years ago, the sorts of things that people are putting in buildings, we're not gonna regulate movie rental stores the same way that we used to, and so forth. So this is permitted as of right. This is permitted by special permit. Kind of MO is the most common one. And depending on the town's regulations, if you want to do something that isn't listed or is otherwise prohibited, you may or may not be able to go to the zoning board of appeals to get a use variance. That the concept that you have to have a hardship in order to get a variance of any kind, basically saying, my property is useless unless I can create an aluminum smelter on it. So you have to give me a variance is a tough argument to make. So, I think use variances are probably more common where, the zone has changed so that what you are doing there now is prohibited, but it had been, permitted before. So you want to get a variance to be able to kind of migrate to a less obsolete prohibited use than what's there now. But that's the only exception that I can think of to the the kind of permissive nature of zoning.
I haven't seen any smelting operations or anything, but it was probably only like 15 years ago that Putnam had telephone operator facility or whatever in their zoning regs, because there's a building on Kennedy Drive that used to have that in there back in the day, many decades ago.
Just one last question on maybe what you're hearing in Hartford about affordable housing seems to be in specific demanded training, there's sessions on it. The conversation about fair share is coming out of Hartford. What are you hearing in terms of how widespread or active some of this discussion is to impact all the towns?
Coincidentally, as I had a meeting in Putnam before this, I was driving out, I had the Council of Small Towns Legislative Update Zoom meeting on small towns, not small minds, not small towns. And they were going through all the different legislation that was being proposed, and the takeaway that I got was that it may be unlikely that the fair share thing is going to happen this year, just because the calculations are not likely to be ready until mid to late May, and then. And in this current session, there may be, more. Pressing issues like a budget that, they'll be spending their time on, but. There are, a number of continuing. Transit-oriented community bills that. There was one that passed the House and got talked to death in the Senate last year. And, it looks like it's going to, at least make it through the House again this year. And the debate, as is the case with so many of these things, is who you believe, in terms of whether it's going to be, truly permissive, or whether it's going to be designed in such a way that it punishes towns, by making them ineligible for steep grants if they don't do X, Y, and Z. The difficult thing to figure out is what's actually going to happen, because, the last week or two of the legislative session is a crazy time for what ultimately gets passed. There's a lot of horse trading there. The transit-oriented community bill, I think, is one that a couple of the leaders in the House feel very strongly about. They felt very strongly about it last year, and didn't have the leverage to force the Senate to pass it. Whether this year will be different or not, remains to be seen, but.
Has there been any traction on the legislature's annual discussion on public notices?
No, I think as is always the case, the newspaper lobbyists are going to be able to, you're going to have to pry that out of their cold dead hands, because, other than obituaries, it's one of the few revenue generating sources they still have left. There was a bill last year that was being discussed that some people sent to me to comment on, and it just was insanely complicated, in terms of towns having to identify the newspaper of substantial circulation in their town, and, if they didn't do that, then that, and, it wasn't solving the problem. It was just making it different problem. There was.
Shopper's guide or something now, right?
Yeah, a lot of people are using the shopper's guide because the villager was too expensive. Yeah, I mean, hardly anybody uses the Current anymore. Norwich Bulletin started doing everything remotely from some other place, and well, it got expensive, and it got expensive, and it got extremely unreliable, which I know created a hardship for some of the towns. Was, you pay the $400 on the premise that something's going to be put in on, 2 consecutive Wednesdays, so you can have your hearings, and then you find out that, oh, we forgot, and it's like, oh, great, now we have to pay $700 to get the second notice in the Current on, for the second Wednesday. So, they're not really helping themselves. All right. Anything else? No, that's been 4.5 hours. And you're all set for the year, for your term.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. No, and I want to thank you all for coming up with questions. Definitely makes it easier than, having to do card tricks or shadow animals or something like that.
Dave?
Make the motion to accept the minutes of March 20th.
We tabled that till next.
Oh, you tabled the whole
Yeah.
thing? Okay.
Yeah.
I withdraw the motion.
Yeah, because nobody had them in front of them.
All right.
So if there's no other questions, I think we'll, ask
Move
for-
to adjourn.
there we go. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Did you second it?
Same thing.
Thank you.
Amy, you know.
Thank you.
The chair, do you have? Yes.
You're right.